the National Press Club the opposition leader Bill Shorten. In a key speech kicking off the political year, Mr Shorten will set the scene for 2018 for Labor, in what may or may not be an election year. Bill Shorten with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. I'm Chris Ullman, and if you are following this conversation online, our hashtag is NPC and our Twitter handle is @PressClubAUST. Well, we begin 2018 where we began 2017, with speculation that there will be a federal election this year. And anyone who's followed federal politics for the last 10 years would know who could possibly say what might happen in an Australian political year. But so let's deal with the known knowns, and that is, for the second time, we begin a National Press Club year with a speech from the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, and for that we are very grateful. Will you please make him welcome?
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be back to start the political year. I first of all wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And can I say how pleased I am that the National Press Club will be hosting Kevin Rudd next month to mark the 10th anniversary of the apology to the stolen generations. As Prime Minister, Kevin had the courage to tell the truth about our history, to say sorry for the injustices and indignities inflicted upon our first Australians. And indeed, it is courage and imagination that I wish to talk about today. That is what I think Australians are looking for in 2018, and that's what I think politics has been lacking. I want to talk about how we can do better. One, by restoring faith in Parliament. Two, by making our economy work for all working Australians, so that people who work hard can get ahead, and that the people who are doing it tough don't get left behind. And three, by making 2018 a year that we tackle the issues, the important generational issues, the important cost of living issues that have been ignored and put in the too hard basket. First of all, let's start with how we can improve our democracy and make politics better. And let me put it as bluntly as most Australians do. 2017 was a particularly bad year for Parliament. I'm not here to point fingers or to play the blame game. I'm prepared to take my share of responsibility. Parliament should reflect the finest qualities of the Australian people: their courage, imagination, their creativity and practical capacity. But in 2017, there was too much circus, too much bickering and squabbling. Don't get me wrong. As Leader of the Opposition, it is still my job to argue against the policies that I disagree with and to put forward positive alternatives. And we'll be doing that on cost of living, better schools, stronger wages, a fairer health system. But that does not mean reducing every political debate to a petty squabble. None of us can change the past. We can do better in the future. And this starts with more transparency, with greater accountability, and rebuilding trust in our institutions, our public institutions, rebuilding trust in democracy itself. This question is far bigger than Malcolm versus me or Liberal versus Labor. This is about restoring confidence in our democratic system, in our public institutions. We should treat this mission as seriously as we take national security, because the most corrosive sentiment awash in Western democracies around the world is the idea that politicians are only in it for themselves. It's simply not true. It's not true of me or Tanya or of any of our team. In fact, it's not true of nearly everyone I've ever come across in politics in my 10 years in Parliament, from all viewpoints and all political parties. But so long as the political news is dominated by the minority who do the wrong thing, the travel rorts and dodgy donors and the sinecures where cabinet ministers walk one day from their job, the next day into a cushy job in the same sector, then we will always have a hard time convincing Australian people that we're serving their interests and not our own. So business as usual, politics as usual, won't cut it in 2018. We need to show some real courage. We need to show that we're fair income, not just feathering our own nests. That's why, if I'm elected Prime Minister, my government will create a National Integrity Commission, a federal body monitored on the lessons of the state anti-corruption bodies. The National Integrity Commission will resolve the gaps and inconsistencies in the current system, designed to ensure the highest standards in public administration. We want to get it underway within our first year of government. And if the Liberals and Nationals want to work with us to get it done sooner, be my guest. This is not about partisanship. It is about trust. I'm not putting this policy forward because I'm aware of any corrupt conduct. If I was, I would report it. I'm doing this because I want to restore people's faith in their representatives and their system of government. So, the following are key design principles for our National Integrity Commission. It has to be independent and well-resourced, secure from government interference. It needs broad jurisdiction, effectively operating as a standing royal commission with all of those investigative powers into serious and systemic corruption in the public sector. The Commission will also have the discretion to hold public hearings when it is considered to be in the public interest. We would have one Commissioner and two deputies, but importantly appointed by Parliament on a bipartisan basis, each serving one fixed 5-year term. The Commission would make findings of fact, not law, and then refer them to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, if appropriate. And it would report to Parliament annually, overseen by a joint standing committee. This is a big move. It's not a decision that I or my colleagues have taken lightly. Over the last 12 months, I've met personally with and spoken to experts about the principles which I've outlined today. I want the National Integrity Commission to be a clear, concrete and impartial mechanism to help restore trust, accountability and transparency in the Commonwealth sector. This is a first step, it's a foundation. But to go further, if we really want to lift confidence in our Parliament, if we want to rebuild a sense that our citizens believe that we work for them and not ourselves, we need to demonstrate that politics has the capacity to make the economy work for working Australians. If you come to any of my town hall meetings, and you're invited, whether it's with Luke Gosling in Palmerston or Fiona Phillips in Nowra, you'll hear the same story. The cost of living is rising, and the kitchen table economics of paying the bills, balancing the family budget, are getting tougher. It costs you more to see the GP or get that scan or that test that you need. And even if you can afford private health insurance, that's going up and up. Buying a house is getting harder. And if you can't afford that, rent is going up and up. Household bills are simply through the roof. Things have always gone up, people understand that. The big difference is that this time the wages are staying down. Our economy has grown since the global financial crisis. Workers are more productive than ever. Company profits went up 20% last year alone. So why are big companies keeping workers' wages low? It's the same reason that they're farming people out to labour hire companies. The same reason that they try and turn every job they can into a casual job. The same reason that CEOs can put up their own pay and up again. It is because they can. And what are the Liberals doing about this? They attack the unions who fight for wage rises for workers. They back arbitrary cuts to weekend penalty rates for some of Australia's lowest paid workers, people who give up their Sundays and public holidays to provide for their family. Now, perhaps Mr Turnbull and co, they genuinely believe that if you give corporations what they want, the world will be a better place. But for the life of me, I do not see how backing up a big truck full of taxpayer funds into the pockets of multinationals in the form of a tax cut is going to help ordinary people. I mean, in what universe do big corporations cut prices when they have a stranglehold on the market? In what universe do corporations pay their fair share of tax if they can find a loophole or a Singapore licence agreement or a tax haven that they can use instead? These are companies and CEOs whose profits and pay packets come from the hard work of Australians. We buy their stuff, we use their services. But if we don't have the right rules and strong standards, if we don't push big companies to pay a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, if we don't demand a better deal and greater security for working Australians, then it just won't happen. I spent 2 decades representing workers, and hard experience has taught me that without representation, corporations do not just hand out pay rises to their employees. You have to argue for it, you have to organise for it, you have to push for it, even if that means taking on vested and powerful interests. For me, it comes down, though, to a simple question. Do you think Australia can be better than this? Do we accept the slide into insecure work and low wages is inevitable? Can we stand up and say no more pushing everyone onto short-term contracts? No more trying to make every job a casual one? No more law of the jungle and survival of the fittest? No more taking away billions of dollars from public health and schools and TAFE and universities and giving it to big business in the form of tax cuts? Can we do better than a society where your postcode and your parents' wealth determines your destiny? My parents weren't wealthy, or a long way from it. They sacrificed a lot so my twin brother and I could get the best possible education. Because Mum, as a teacher, knew herself that education changes lives. My mum's decision certainly changed my life. It's why I'm able to stand here today. But this week, as schools start again, there are a lot of parents out there who are worried that no matter what they do, because of cost of living and because of cuts to schools, their child will go without the best possible education. Too many parents who feel that the deal that they're handing on to their kids is a lesser deal than the one that they inherited from their parents. So I ask again, can Australia be better than this? Can we do better? For all those people who feel like they are getting left behind, can we be a country who properly values older workers looking for re-employment in their 50s and 60s? A country where women are paid the same as men? A country where our first Australians enjoy equal opportunity? A country with a proper NBN? Can we be a country where a generation of people who loved us and nurtured us and looked after us as we grew are properly cared for as they grow older? Can we be an energy superpower, harnessing clean energy as our international competitive advantage? Now, there is no doubt in my mind that when we put our minds to this exercise and when our hearts are truly in it, the answer is we can be this country. Yes, absolutely. Australia can be every one of these things. And in 2018, my side of politics is going to lay out a vision for Australia. Fairer, stronger, more inclusive, where no one gets left behind. This starts with stronger wages for working Australians. Our wages system is no longer delivering. And it's not just cuts to penalty rates or the exploitation of labour hire. Enterprise bargaining itself is on life support. It should be a driver of both wages growth and productivity. But the number of enterprise agreements ratified by the Fair Work Commission last year was the lowest number since 1995, when the enterprise bargaining system was in its infancy. It's never been easier for business to take the drastic option, the nuclear option, detonate negotiations, terminate agreements, threaten to send workers back to award minimums unless they accept a cut to their wages and their conditions. In the last financial year, agreement terminations by employers were more than double the long-term average. And in that process, all those carefully negotiated conditions are wiped away. You start again. Every enterprise agreement, every pay rise negotiated was in return for improvements in the workplace. But now, the game of snakes and ladders is just simply a game of snakes for workers. And for people who can't bargain together, they are now reliant on the minimum wage, which has been going backwards relative to median wages for years. This disadvantages employers who do the right thing and negotiate. I was brought up in a system which said that you wanted employees and employers to negotiate together to create value, to create growth and productivity, and in return better conditions. We now have a system which creates incentive and rewards the employers who aren't interested in negotiating, and that sets everyone back. I mean, when you look at the proportion of workers who rely on award wages, it has grown from 16% in 2012 to 24%. In the Hawke-Keating years, we were told that the award system was the safety net and we would have a better outcome with more agreements. Now the award system has become more relevant and more central to how people are paid than we were ever promised 2 decades ago. This is a big deal. It is a vicious cycle. Brendan O'Connor spoke about this here at the Press Club a few months ago. But when was the last time you ever heard our Minister for Workplace Relations talk about this problem? When was the last time you ever heard a government minister say anything about workers and wages and bargaining and productivity that wasn't bookended by union bashing? Business leaders understand what I'm talking about. Economists understand it. Getting working Australians a pay rise is a key to confidence. The confidence which keeps your wallet, your purse and indeed your business open. I start from the basic proposition that a wages policy which only looks after the very wealthy is a wages policy not worth having. That's why we will restore Sunday penalty rates. We will crack down on the exploitation of labour hire. We will put the bargaining back into enterprise bargaining, and we will lead a new national push to close the gender pay gap. The biggest job growth is in feminised industries, but as there is a gender pay gap, that is actually increasing the problem of low wages across this country. Having said all of that, I'm still conscious that for millions of working people, business as usual, wage stagnation as usual, simply isn't good enough. The minimum wage is no longer a living wage, and the current framework simply doesn't give adequate consideration to contemporary cost of living pressures that working people are battling. Let me use some examples. Over the past year, the increase in electricity prices has been nearly 6 times wages growth. The rise in health-related costs has been double wages growth. Residential house prices have increased by more than 8% over the past year. That's 4 times wages growth. The current system of slow incremental increases is seeing too many working people fall behind. Now, there are many things to admire about the United States, but their wages system isn't an example. It's a cautionary tale. I don't want us to be a nation that pays adults $7 and $8 an hour, where people work full-time but still rely on food stamps and charity. Of course, we've got to be mindful of the capacity of industry to pay, but let me make this clear. We need to fix the disconnect between wages and productivity. We need to repair the link between hard work and fair reward, and rebuild the idea that a fairly paid workforce is a more productive workforce in a more profitable business. Our goal should be a real living wage, effectively raising the pay of all Australians, particularly the 2.3 million who depend upon the minimum rates in the awards. This is my vision for our economy. Grow the economy, increase the productivity and fairly distribute the rewards. Effectively, jobs growth and wages growth. Prosperity which works for everyone. Of course, income tax has an impact on the family budget. That's why Labor is opposing the government's plan to increase taxes for Australians earning up to $87,000. That's over 7 million people. The Prime Minister and Treasurer keep talking about an income tax cut someday, somewhere. But their last budget actually included an income tax increase for everyone but the top income earners. How cynical is this? They hike your taxes now so that they can claim credit for cutting them later. So before this debate goes any further this year, let's be very clear. The Liberals are budgeting for higher taxes on workers and lower taxes for millionaires, whereas Labor has a tax cut for middle and working class Australians on the table right now. If you're a teacher on $65,000, you'll be $325 better off under Labor. If you're a nurse working overtime, earning $70,000, you'll be $350 better off under Labor. We start 2018 one big middle-income tax cut ahead of the government. And if the Liberals want to talk about putting more money in the pockets of families, they could start by dropping this tax hit on working people. Now, for 2 years, the government have been spruiking a hugely expensive unfunded tax cut for big business. And now they're talking about an unfunded income tax cut, all on the never-never. If you fed income about tax relief, then you have to explain how you pay for it. Chris Bowen, Jim Chalmers and Andrew Lee, they've helped me lead the policy debate on tax reform and on budget repair that's fair. We will close tax loopholes at the top end, like income splitting through discretionary trusts, or unlimited deductions for high-priced accountants to minimise your tax. And we will not be spending $37 billion of taxpayer money subsidising property investors. Not while school results in English and maths and science go backwards, not while 100,000 older Australians are on waiting lists for aged care packages, and not while young Australians are priced out of the housing market. We do not support spending $65 billion, the bulk of which will benefit foreign shareholders, when we could be investing in Australians and their opportunities. So yes, there are big policy differences this year. If you are a multinational, a millionaire, or someone looking to buy a swag of investment properties, you will no longer receive the excessively generous taxpayer handouts that the government thinks is more important than investing in services. But if you're a working Australian, a pay-as-you-go taxpayer, a first home buyer, a young person looking to go to university or get an apprenticeship, we're on your side. I said earlier that there are issues that we will lead on in 2018 that are being ignored by this government. Aged care is one, tackling dementia properly is another. These are massive intergenerational challenges that all Australians face. But there's another much more immediate problem: massive increases in the cost of health care. The Liberals' Medicare freeze has effectively done the job of a GP tax that they always wanted. It's driven up out-of-pocket costs. Costs up 20% for a visit to the doctor, costs up 25% for a visit to the specialist. And the price hikes don't stop there. As someone wryly remarked last week, there used to be two certainties in life, death and taxes. Now it's three: death, taxes and big increases in health insurance premiums. For years, PHI premiums have been rising at triple the rate of inflation, way above the pace of wages. Families are paying an average of more than $1,000 than they were when the Liberals were elected in 2013. Prices are up, profits are up, quality and value down. Australians are paying a lot more for their health insurance policies and getting a lot less. 10 years ago, only 8.6% of health insurance policies contained exclusions. Now it's 40%. These exclusions, often hidden in the fine print, mean that people are paying for insurance without being covered. It's turning health insurance into a con. You know the stories. People who go to their doctor needing cataracts removed or knee surgery or hip replacement or a hysterectomy. And they're told that even though they're paying some of the highest out-of-pocket expenses in the OECD, even though they could be paying in excess of $4,000 to their private provider, it just so happens that that particular procedure is not covered by their insurer. Now, I'm not talking about the small operators in this industry or the not-for-profits, but I am talking about an industry that raked in $1.8 billion in profit before tax last year. Most publicly listed companies get a return on equity of about 8%. The banks average well north of 10%. But some of the biggest health insurance providers pocket a return of over 20%. This is an industry that's holding about $6 billion over and above the legal capital requirement. Oh, and they're receiving $6 billion in taxpayer-funded subsidies each year. Yet, despite having a stack of cash in the bank, profits in the billions and government support, the private health insurers keep aggressively increasing their premiums each year. I thought Greg Hunt premature last week when he was declaring mission accomplished when premiums only went up by twice the wage rate, twice the inflation rate. You know, for some families with 2 kids, this means $200 more they have to find. I understand balancing family budgets. I get that a $200 increase has to be found by the family from somewhere. I'm fed up with the private health insurance industry treating Australians like mugs, gouging people on the basis of a con. Public healthcare costs are up, private health insurance costs are up. When it comes to health, right across the board, we can do better for Australia. There's another generational challenge that I want to put right back at the top of the political charts: climate change. Any political party with an ounce of character will go to the people of the next election with a proper economic and environmental recognition of the reality of climate change, a proper demonstration that we have the courage to do what has to be done, even if it is politically difficult. For the last 2 years, the Great Barrier Reef has suffered severe coral bleaching. And over summer, it was revealed emissions have continued to increase, making it likely that Australia will miss the government's already modest 2030 target. Australia doesn't need to spend $1 billion lending money to a coal mining billionaire, but we do need a national energy policy. We have all the sun and the wind that you want, and with it we can make an endless supply of energy that the whole world is moving towards. Of course, we know that Tony Abbott went to open war with renewables, crushing confidence, spooking investors and shedding jobs. But now, just as the sector is recovering, I'm concerned that the Prime Minister is willing to sell it out to placate his angry backbench. Every time a light globe flickers, the government spend a whole question time blaming renewables. Yet analysis from Bloomberg New Energy Finance shows that the Liberals' so-called energy guarantee would see annual investment in large-scale renewable energy cut by 95%. No serious energy plan anywhere in the world is built upon an assumption of a decline in renewables investment. It's like releasing a roads policy based on the resurgence of the horse and cart, or an NBN based upon copper. Labor's objectives are clear, achievable and responsible. 50% renewables by 2030, a 45% cut in pollution by 2030, zero net pollution by 2050. If we want lower prices and more secure energy, we have to back the transition to renewables. If we want new industry and new technologies creating new jobs here, then we have to back the transition to renewables. If we want our kids to be able to take their kids to visit the reef, then we have to back the transition to renewables. We're Australians. We've got the brains, we have the get up and go. You can bet that we can build an energy system where everyone can have energy at affordable prices and, indeed, renewables helping the environment. So, in conclusion, when you cut through the noise, the Prime Minister's central argument is that we should stick with him because this is as good as it gets. Growth is up. The top end of town have a tax cut coming. Business as usual and trickle-down economics will all we need from here. Apparently, flatlining wages, though, is as good as it gets for working families. Insecure work at irregular hours is all that people can hope for. Soaring power bills for houses and business are as good as it gets. House prices, which push people out of their communities, are okay, as long as investors are still able to get a taxpayer-funded subsidy. Rising levels of inequality are fine, as long as the right people are inheriting their opportunities. The Prime Minister seems to think that if he sets the bar just low enough, he can keep claiming victory for climbing over it. I think that politics should be better than the bare minimum, better than a low-risk, low-ambition pursuit of the lowest common denominator. I'm going to spend 2018 explaining to people why I think we can do better, by restoring faith in the way that government works, by restoring faith in an economy which works for all people, for all Australians, and by taking on the hard generational issues, even if they are politically difficult, even if it means confronting scare campaigns or vested interests. To my team, I say that Australia can be better, and and Labor can be better too. In 2018, we need to be as courageous, imaginative and practical as the Australian people themselves. And I'll have a lot more to say about this in the year ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Opposition Leader. We'll go straight now to our questions from journalists and begin with the Daily Telegraph.
Thanks for your speech, Mr Shorten.
Thank you.
If I could ask about the National Integrity Commission. The Public Service Commission I saw in the Senate inquiry said that if we were going to set something up like this, it would be probably expensive, perhaps unnecessary, and it would be far from certain whether it was going to find any more corruption than the current public agencies already do now. Now, you said that there are gaps and there are inconsistencies in the current system. Could you tell me what those gaps and inconsistencies are?
All right, just to go to the first part of your question, I'm sure that when state anti-corruption bodies were created, there would have been a Public Service Commission submitting to the state parliament before that. There's no need to look here. I think, though, that we have seen over time that the state anti-corruption bodies have indeed found some problems, and indeed I think of serving also an educative role and listing the general standard of ethics, and I think it's now time for the Commonwealth to do that. I do believe that we need to have a National Integrity Commission. Whilst we've got a range of agencies who do some of the functions, it's clear when you study it that there are inconsistencies and there are gaps, and I think a National Integrity Commission, as we design it, can look at where we can include any of those functions currently performed by other bodies. But I've got no doubt that Australian people do want us to see us to step up. Now, as I said earlier, I have no knowledge of any corruption. If I did, I'd report it. But the point about it is that we do need to actually set up a body which restores faith by people in the system. Now, the reality is a third of Australia are not interested in the major parties at the moment. And if you ask more Australians, I think politics is just all about being in it for yourself and not for the people. What we need to do is show that we're willing to make tough decisions to restore a bit of faith. I don't think if the government back this and I back this that it's going to change the outcome of the election. But that's not why I'm doing it. We've got to rebuild faith in our institutions. So I've got no doubt that as we work through the design principles, as we consult, I think most Australians are going to support what I've outlined today. And I invite the government to do the same.
Network 10.
Phoebe Bowden from Network 10. You say that 2017 was a particularly bad year for federal politics and that people have lost trust. What do you see as the most damaging recent example from federal Labor for the public perception?
I think it's a collective responsibility, but I do think the citizenship debate made us all look like we're just focused on ourselves and not on the needs of ordinary people.
ABC.
Tom Miggleton from the 7:30 program at the ABC. Mr Shorten, thank you for your speech. I wanted to bring you to your comments that the wages system isn't working for working people. And try and bring you to a specific example of that. Do you think that the aborted train drivers' strike in Sydney should have gone ahead? Do you agree with Sally McManus that it didn't go ahead was a sign of a broken system? And what would you do to fix that broken system?
As you know, I think what drives the train drivers' dispute, and I haven't followed it closely, is that the New South Wales train system is relying upon overtime to be able to get its trains to run. I think any system which relies upon overtime as a core business model is a problem. I think the real problem in the New South Wales train dispute is that the New South Wales government hasn't trained enough train drivers. In terms of the arbitration and resolution of the dispute, that'll work through. The broader issue I'm saying about the system not working is that traditionally we've been brought up on a classical economic theory which says that as the job markets tighten, wages go up. That's not happening. And I think it's, even conservative economists who perhaps traditionally wouldn't be ones who'd support seeing wages move are actually forming an unusual coalition with unions and others who say, actually, what is holding the economy back is a lack of confidence. But what I want to say, what that lack of confidence is too many people are getting left behind. When you see power bills, I went through them, power bills increasing at multiple times the level of wages, that's a problem. Where you see out-of-pocket healthcare costs increasing at a far greater rate than wages, that's a problem. When you see the back-to-school costs of education That's a problem, going higher than wages. Where you see a whole range of issues, cost of living, from energy to healthcare, housing prices, and our wages system is not delivering. There's a disconnect. Do you know in the last 10 years, productivity has risen about 20%, but real wages 6%. The deal is the Australians work hard, they generate productivity, but then they get the fair distribution of the growth and productivity. That nexus is broken. And to be fair to some employers, they've got some pretty sharp lawyers. They say, oh, you pay your workers, maybe, contractors. There's an ESO dispute down at Longford on the Victorian Northwoods. And what's happened there is that you can use a labour hire company in WA, sign up 3 or 4 workers to a much lower set of conditions than applies to 6 companies and 200 maintenance contractors in Gippsland, and then the company says, well, that's the new agreement. So all of a sudden, 200 workers who work in rigs and all sorts of conditions are faced with take it or leave it contracts for work practices they've already negotiated. The system's not working, and my real fear, Tom, is that if we don't do something about a living wage, if we don't reverse the cut to penalty rates, if we don't do something about the gender pay gap, if we don't fix up the bargaining system, we're going to create 2 Australias. We're going to create a left-behind society. And the people in that left-behind society, they're already feeling it. The kid who drops out of university because he can't juggle the second job and go to university. The family who's on a waiting list for public housing but has to wait 20 years, left behind. The older worker, left behind because of the discrimination in the workforce against older people. You can look at example after example after example. And what we're seeing is a left-behind society. And Labor's not going to leave people behind, and that's why the wages system, front and centre, it is one of the inputs into cost of living and the capacity to cope with it.
But would you say it's a fair point to say that the Fair Work Commission has removed the right to strike, and do you think that's something that needs to be fixed?
Oh, I think the ability to bargain is important. And in bargaining, of course, people have always had the right to take legally protected industrial action. But for me, if you like, the question about the strike is the wrong way around. The problem is we've got companies terminating agreements. The business doesn't want to bargain anymore. I always understood that if we moved away from central wage fixation and a reliance on the award system to bargaining, that was the deal. Workers negotiate productivity, but now what happens at the end of every agreement is even though the workers have traded off conditions to get pay rises, they're presented with a pay cut unless they trade off more conditions. So it's like paying for your house every 3 years. It's not fair, and I think we can do better.
The Australian Financial Review.
Hi, Mr. Shorten. Phil Curry from the AFR. Just on the wages and cost of living stuff, you've talked about bargaining, private health insurance and the minimum wage. Can we deduce from that on enterprise bargaining that you will remove some of the powers of employers using legislation to remove their ability to terminate agreements and so forth? And what are you getting at on the minimum wage? Are you going to change the way that is set? Are you going to put limits on, on how that's going to be done, so it will be increased? And on private health insurance, you identified a problem, but you didn't say what you might do. Are you talking about a moratorium on increases or linking them to CPI? Can we just get a bit more detail, please?
Well, let me answer those 3 or 4 questions. The first one about the bargaining, we have said, and we previously said, and I think it's right, that the ability of companies to unilaterally terminate agreements and say to workers who might be, on $60,000 or $70,000 or $80,000 a year, that unless you take a wage cut, we will put you back on the award, which is, could be $25,000 or $30,000. That's unfair. So we don't think that should be allowed. I think existing agreements should stay in place till they're renegotiated by mutual agreement. In terms of the award system, I think the IR experts call it the bite. The difference between the median wage and the minimum wage, and that bite, the gap is getting bigger. And so at the same time as we see more people going on to the awards, the distance between the minimum wage and the median wage is growing. And no clearer example of that than women workers. A lot of the new jobs that are being created through the NDIS, a lot of those jobs are in irregular, but they're irregular work, contract work, casual work, and of course it's a feminised industry. So what's happening is that you're seeing the jobs growth happening at the low end of the market where wages are not increasing, and you're seeing people squeezed. So I do think that we need to have a look not just at the minimum wage, but what is the living wage? If you go through 2006, 2017, those list of items I went through, Your health costs are up, no question about that. The freeze has had its effect. The private health insurers, well, they're on their own. They're having a party. And then you've got the energy prices. They're up. Have a look at your water bill and your gas bill. That's up. Have a look at the income tax increase that Mr Turnbull's trying to increase. Another 0.5% out of your tax. Up to 87,000. There's a lot happening, so we need to revisit the living wage. But that takes work, it takes consultation, and that's what I'm committing to do this year. In terms of private health insurance, there's a number of options which are potentially on the table, and we're working through them. But I put private health insurance, the big end, the big multinationals, the big profitable companies on notice. Business as usual doesn't work. If you're getting a $6 billion subsidy from the taxpayer, yet you're making record profits, yet the prices are going up and the exclusions are going up, well, that's a problem. Now, they're not the sole player in the system. It's very complex. But I'm committed to consultation, working through the issues. But private health insurance, I want to save it. You're not going to save it by increasing the prices the way they've gone up for families $1,000 since the Liberals have got in. Whilst maybe Mr Hunt was well intentioned, he said, "Oh, it's only a 4% increase this year." Where do the government think people find the money for? We now have got a left-behind society where some people, when they get the electricity bill, pay that on the credit card because they don't have the cash to pay it. And then, of course, then they're caught in the trap of paying 20% interest. That's a left-behind society, and we've got to do something about cost of living.
And briefly, if the private health insurance doesn't fix itself, would you withdraw the government subsidy or threaten that?
Oh, listen, you're getting well ahead of me there. I want to talk to the private health insurers, but business as usual is not cutting it. And if you ever want to go to a barbecue and talk to a stranger, have a whinge about your private health insurance bill. You'll make a friend straight away.
Great party. Network 7.
It's Canberra.
Mr Shorten, Tim Lester from the 7 Network. Anthony Albanese has suggested twin referendums on Australia Day, Indigenous recognition and the Republic. Can you endorse Mr Albanese's formula here today? And if you can't, what would you do as Prime Minister to meet the expectation that's emerged about changing Australia Day, the date of Australia Day?
Honestly, I think it's an interesting idea, and both Albo, Noel Pearson, a range of people have been commenting about what we should do on Australia Day. But I think the more substantial point, which he made and which I've made previously, is we should have an Australian head of state, really. It was like, Australia's been around, modern Australia, been around for since 200 plus years. It's time for us to have our own head of state. So I think that is a priority for Australia, and I've appointed an assistant shadow minister to help champion that. But the other thing which I also fundamentally believe, and I'm indebted to our Indigenous MPs in the Labor team, who I think have given me great guidance on this, is first and foremost, we should have recognition of our first Australians in the Constitution. I thought Malcolm was intemperate when he just ruled out of hand the Uluru Declaration, the Statement from the Heart. I don't think it was necessarily what people were expecting as the proposed model after all the consultations. But why do we in Parliament get the right just to tell first Australians what they're allowed to put to us? So I do think a voice has got our basis. And it won't be a third chamber of Parliament, as some of the scaremongers and the knuckle-draggers said. The idea of consulting people before we make decisions which empower them, I don't think that's radical. I actually thought it was quite a conservative proposition. So they're my two priorities, the voice and then the Australian head of state. In terms of Australia Day, I'm sure there's plenty of more interesting discussions to come on that matter. What I won't do, though, again, I thought Malcolm was perhaps ill-advised to sneer at the people who want to debate changing the day. It's a free country. We're allowed to express our views. There are legitimate alternatives. And on that basis, we'll keep looking at that issue too.
The Australian.
Hello, Greg Brown from The Australian. I'd like to ask you about negative gearing. Given the property boom is ending, largely due to a number of factors, but due to a tightening of mortgage lending, and there are expectations of price declines this year, particularly in inner-city apartment markets, does this show that your policy has become redundant as prices are going to moderate anyway? And does the policy become more politically tricky coming up to the next election in an environment where people are going to see the values of their houses decline and they may even be struggling to sell them?
Well, like most Australians, I spent my summer not thinking too much about the day-to-day of politics. I took the opportunity. We're very lucky in Australia over summer that you can have that opportunity to think about the long term, and that's what I've done and started to explain to you. But one issue which did penetrate my consciousness as you're sitting on the beach was the revelation that Treasury had looked at our policy on negative gearing and found out the government had been just a tad naughty in the way they characterised it. It's a good policy. We're sticking to it. It will help, I think, ease some of the price pressures on housing, so we will stick to it. I think the longer-term question is, why is the government so determined to give priority to investment speculators over people trying to find their first home? I would suggest to you that whilst there are points in what you say about housing prices going down or apartments or in some regions, go and speak to families at the next Saturday of auctions and see if they reckon the prices are really going down. So I do think there's still a problem with first home ownership in this country. Only Labor has a plan to support first home owners getting an equal go. It's all about this left behind society. I can promise you, and I'm sure many of you in this room and many people watching this across Australia know, families, couples who've saved up, they think they're in with a chance to make that bid, only to come 20 and 30% below what the house goes for. We do have a first home problem in some of our big cities, and Labor is the only party with a fair income, albeit politically difficult proposition, as you flagged, to help first home owners get an equal go. Because I don't want people who don't have rich parents who can't help them buy their first home left behind.
The conversation.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Can I return to that issue which so dominated us last year, the citizenship issue? It does seem that the High Court is not going to deal with the case of David Feeney for some little time, which would push the expected by-election into mid-year, which wouldn't be very convenient for you. Do you expect Mr Feeney to preempt the court and quit in the next week or so, and have you advised him to do so?
Listen, David did the right thing by referring himself to the High Court when he couldn't discover papers to demonstrate that he'd done what he'd said he'd done. I think he has the right to prepare his case in the manner in which he chooses to, and I'm letting him do that.
Guardian Australia.
Hello, Mr Shorten.
Hello.
Catherine Murphy from Guardian Australia. I hate to quote your own speech to you, but I will, just for a moment. So you've said to us today that any political party with an ounce of character will go to the people at the next election with a proper recognition of the economic and environmental reality of climate change and a proper demonstration that we have the courage to do what has to be done, even if that might be politically difficult. Now, this morning on The Guardian, we've quoted a range of experts who say that environmental protection is the hardest to secure now than it's been since the Franklin campaign of the 1980s. The Adani campaign in Queensland is the biggest civil society campaign we've seen since the Franklin. What would an incoming Labor government do to stop this project?
Well, I've said about the Adani project that it has to stack up commercially and environmentally. I was very fortunate to be able to visit the reef last week and talk to some of the experts, and also talk to landholders and environmentalists about the project. I think it's fair to say that the reef is under great stress. Now, some people say you're not allowed to say that because they don't want to go to the reef. The reef's still there, people should still go there. But I think the reef's done so much in the way of jobs. It's arguably our greatest natural asset. I do think that we need to do more to protect the reef. So that's one sort of point I want to put in the ground. The second thing is, I do get that there is legitimate concern about the Adani project. Some people say that we should be concerned because the banks won't back it. That's a point. Others say that we should be concerned because there's a glut of this coal on the international market. Others say we should be concerned about the project because it might jeopardise the job security of other coal miners and other coal mining regions of Australia. Others have pointed to me the concern about the Great Artesian Basin and the lack of clarity about whether or not the open cut processes at Adani will in fact interfere with the Great Artesian Basin. There's the concerns about the reef. There's also the more general proposition, which I respect, and that's at the heart of the point in my speech, and I'm flattered you read it out to me. You can't be serious about climate change and energy and sort of have a bet every which way. So we're certainly looking at the Adani matter very closely. If it doesn't stack up commercially, if it doesn't stack up environmentally, it will absolutely not receive our support.
Do you have a time frame on that?
Yeah, it's underway.
Date?
Which date do you want?
The one where you conclude on what you're going to do.
We're looking at it. We'll certainly conclude well before. Tell you what, we'll conclude it well before the next election.
Okay, the West Australian.
Mr Shorten, Sarah Martin from the West. I wanted to ask you about Labor's position on the company tax cuts. You're steadfastly opposed to the $65 billion package, but $30 billion of that is already locked in and legislated. Can you confirm today that you will go to the next election with a policy to reverse those $30 billion in tax cuts? And if not, is it not misleading to continue to campaign against the entire $65 billion package?
Well, we've made it perfectly clear for well over a year that we support the tax cut for businesses up to $2 million. So I'd be very happy if we could all be very clear on that. We've supported that ever since it was said. And for the record, that's 87% of businesses. But the case has not been made by this government to give companies with very large turnovers tax relief. The fact of the matter is that many of these companies, the profits will be returned to foreign shareholders. The fact of the matter is that there is no guarantee. And we haven't seen it happen because there's been corporate tax cut reductions. They haven't been handed to workers and increased wages, otherwise we wouldn't have the wage stagnation we've got. So we'll finalise our policy in response to that after this budget. We certainly see the case for under $2 million. We certainly have not seen the case made for unfunded tax cuts for lots of large companies. I mean, put it this way. If you take billions and billions of dollars out of the national ATM, that's foregone income. That has two effects. One effect it has is that you increase the debt or you've got to cut services further. If you increase the debt, it means that the remaining budget has to service higher interest payments. Or you just cut billions and billions of dollars further from our universities, from our pensioners, from our schools, from our hospitals. The case is not made out. So the other thing about the government love to say about corporate tax cuts is Labor's previously supported corporate tax cuts, but only when you had new revenue to replace it. I mean, there's three alternatives for this government to fund this corporate tax cut. New taxes, higher interest payments on the deficit, or cutting services. They haven't answered that question.
Fairfax.
Thank you. Mr Shorten, Mark Kenny from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Can I take you back to the National Anti-Corruption body that you've announced a commitment to today?
Yep.
Get a few details on that, I guess. What's your thinking behind the fixed maximum 5-year term for the Commissioner and deputies? And what would be the remit? How broad would be the remit of this body? Would it, for example, be able to, last year, would it have been able to be used to do the Parliament-wide audit of MPs in relation to citizenship matters? Would it have been able to look at, say, the helicopter flight of a certain person who was Speaker in the past? Would it look at the pecuniary interests, say the receipt of a bottle of Grange, as was a big story in the New South Wales ICAC? Is that the kind of thing it would be able to do?
You asked a serious question. What was the very first... Oh, the term of appointment. In forming the design principles which we've adopted, I'm indebted to Transparency International. I'm indebted to a range of senior judges and people who have been involved in state corruption commissions. After discussion with them and, of course, with my Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, we formed the view this position is so powerful that one term is enough, and they agree. So that design principle is one which we worked out in consultation, talking to not only my own people, but the Australia Institute, Transparency International and other reformers who've been calling on this. In terms of expenses and all of those matters, we have now set up a Parliamentary Expenses Authority. I believe that for expense matters in the first instance, that's where they will go. The remit, though, of the National Integrity Commission is this. We want to make sure that the administration of the Commonwealth is impartial and free from untoward influence. So what we're proposing, it would cover the judiciary. It would cover the Commonwealth Public Service. It would cover businesses and people who transact with the Commonwealth. It would even cover the Governor-General. So it would have a broad remit. We will, and we've got a discussion paper and a series of a fact guide, which if you haven't got, we will distribute to you very soon, today. And we will sit down with people. And I also say to the government, I know that the Deputy Prime Minister sort of ruled it out on Sunday. We are happy to work with them. It doesn't. have to be a Labor-Liberal sort of punch and Judy show. Specifically, for instance, the appointment of the Commissioner would be done by the Parliament. It wouldn't be a Liberal appointee or a Labor appointee, it would be a Parliament appointee. I think that is an important development too.
Sky News.
David Spears from Sky News. Thank you for your speech, and yes, certainly look forward to seeing that fact sheet on what you've announced today.
Yeah.
Can I go to a specific question,
Sure.
Which may or may not be in that fact sheet? Would this Integrity Commission look at political donations and how that may influence what a politician does or says? Would it look, for example, at the Sam Dastyari case of last year? Can I also just clarify something you said earlier too on private health insurance? Are you looking at winding back the private health insurance rebate?
Okay, let me go to the NIC stuff first. Specifically on the Dastyari matter, I'm not going to play National Integrity Commissioner. What we would do is we want to see donations reform in addition. We think that foreign donations to political parties should be stopped. My party's already stopped that. We think that there should be transparency of donations over $1,000. I don't see the National Integrity Commission as the only reform. I think that we do need to reform our donation system in addition. The National Integrity Commission's remit would be to look at systemic and serious corruption. So it will depend on the facts of the matter. In terms of private health insurance, I think the first thing we want to do, let's not put the cart before the horse, is that I think the fees increase too much. I think the premium rises are too high. I think that's the issue. We see people dropping out of private health insurance. I think there needs to be better monitoring of the exclusions. This has to be done with the industry as well as talking about the industry. I'm sure that we can get a better deal. I'm not convinced, though, in the last 5 years, this government, when it's had a 25, 26% increase in premiums, can arguably say mission accomplished. It is a major cost of living burden on top of the Medicare freeze. I mean, the fact of the matter is, under the Liberals, it just costs more to go to see a doctor, it costs more to go and get a consultation with a specialist, and those increases have been increasing faster than wages. Today, for me, it's all about making sure that the economy and growth, not only that we have it, but that we don't have a left-behind society where we have people who, pensioners, who put off taking their blood-thinning medication and their prescriptions because they simply can't afford to. This is the real world which too many of our Australians are forced to live in because of cost of living pressures, and we will be champions of people who are suffering cost of living pressures, and we will have arguments with vested interests in the top end of town because someone's got to do it on behalf of the people who are doing it hard.
SBS.
Maria Zivic from SBS, thank you very much for your address. Some leaked cabinet documents today show that Scott Morrison, while he was Immigration Minister, tried to delay permanent protection visas for asylum seekers. The Prime Minister's defended that this morning. Given that under your leadership, Labor's immigration policies have inched closer to those of the coalition, would you defend that too?
I don't know all the facts of the case in that, but when you say inched closer, let me make it very clear, because sometimes the government tries to mischaracterise Labor's position. We want to stop the people smugglers. Whenever the government says Labor won't do that, they are giving a signal to the people smugglers to test our system. I wish for once they'd think about the national interest and people's safety rather than just trying to turn it into a partisan issue. More generally, I'll have to examine what was said in those cabinet papers. I've been preparing for this today.
News Corporation.
Mr Shorten, Claire Bickers from News Corporation. Similar to that issue, there was a report this morning that 25 asylum seekers left Indonesia on a boat bound for Australia late last week. There was Rohingya and Afghan refugees on board. An ANU expert has already predicted this could be the start of a fresh wave of asylum seekers headed for Australia. If you become Prime Minister, what will you do to counter this?
Well, we will certainly continue the boat turn-back policy where it is safe to do so, as the current government does. We will do everything we can to discourage people smugglers. But let's also go to perhaps the part of the question which is unasked, but a lot of Australians ask me in the street. That does not mean, therefore, we should have indefinite detention for people on Manus and Nauru. I don't accept that it's a binary, indefinite detention or people smugglers. I don't think that's right. In terms of stopping people smugglers, we'll take the advice of our security experts and our border security experts, and we maintain absolute commitment to defeating and stopping the people smugglers, because when they persuade and lure people onto the boats, they are not only making money and trying to exploit off people's misery, but they are exposing people to drowning, death. So that's why we don't want them back in business, full stop.
And we'll finish with AAP.
Colin Brinston, AAP. Labor's been ahead in the polls seemingly forever, and yet despite the concerns about wages, electricity prices, etc., the Liberals are always seen as the better managers of the economy. What has Labor got to do to change that perception?
I think if you ask people who's better at managing the economy in the interests of working and middle-class people, I think people look at Labor pretty positively. The battleground for Australians is cost of living. There is growth. We don't argue with that. We're pleased with it. There are jobs growth. We're pleased with that. Not going to be merely mouthed or negative about that. It's excellent. But what isn't happening is that I don't believe that the benefits of growth are being distributed equally in our society. We've seen productivity go up. I think I quoted that number in an earlier answer. 20%, yet real wages 6%. Corporate profits went up 20% last year, yet wages went up 2%. There is a disconnect. You know, we are in danger of creating two societies, a left-behind society. You're left behind if you've got to give up your uni place because you're juggling two jobs and you can't afford to do it all. You're left behind if you're on a public housing waiting list and it goes for years and years and years. You're left behind if you can't afford to buy your first house because you're 20 to 30% shy of what the ultimate settlement price is. You're left behind if you are in your middle years and one of your loved parents has got dementia and there's a 100,000 person waiting list. You're left behind if you're in a region, a country town, and your hospital hasn't had any capital works or any modern equipment. You know, you're left behind if you're someone who lives in your 50s and 60s. You know, you've worked hard your whole life, you've been dislocated by manufacturing change, and you can't get another job. So this country is not working equally. You're left behind if you're a woman working in a feminised industry and you effectively work your first 2 months every year for free because men in male-dominated industries have got a 20% wage advantage over women working in feminised industries. My concern is that we are creating two Australias, that we're leaving people behind, and the problems are real. Business as usual doesn't cut it, and my concern is that Australians have given up. Many of them think that both political parties, we're just in it for ourselves. They want to know who's going to stand up for them. They don't need me to tell them that the health costs are too high. They don't need me to tell them that taking the kids to the doctor is more expensive than it was 5 years ago. They don't need me to tell them that their income tax is going to go up. They don't need me to tell them that their power bills are up. I don't need to tell young people who are reassured, don't worry about the reef. We're not going to do anything to mitigate the effects of climate change. Don't worry about it. It'll be a problem for you in the future. This country can work better. It's not about Liberal or Labor. It's about, can this country be better? Can we be better? Today I've outlined some of the priorities and the approach we're taking this year. It is a bit of a change from last year. We want to be better in the way we conduct ourselves. We're proposing the National Integrity Commission because we think we can be better. We want to be better in the policies we talk about and the solutions we offer. We're going to talk to the Australian people. That's our work for this year, and I think we can all be better. Thank you.
Can I say thank you again for kicking off this political year for the second year in a row? And I should say, since there is always speculation about an election year, we are hearing from the alternative Prime Minister. We have, of course, put in an invitation. There is a standing invitation to the Prime Minister himself. He's yet to say yes, but we hope to hear from him shortly. But thank you again for coming today. And as always, genuinely, for the last couple of years, in fact the last 3 years, when you've come with some serious policy proposals, given us something to think about. So get another membership to the National Press Club.
Clear that on the register.
Note you never come here to drink, so you might as well have that for your office. So thanks very much, mate.